Chair, thank you, Commissioner, for coming out this afternoon. Good to see you again, and all your department officials as well. I have a lot of questions here today, so we'll keep them as, if your replies can be as brief as possible, that would be appreciated. So off with a very short yes or no here. Is the government on track to meet their 2030 emissions reduction targets? Just a yes or no.
No.
Commissioner, did the Environment Department ever indicate to your office that the government would not meet the 2030 emission targets with existing measures?
Yes, they've indicated that their calculation is that they're on track for about 36%, and the target is 40 to 45%.
So the Environment Department was aware they wouldn't meet their emissions targets?
Yes.
So why does Minister Guilbeault keep on telling Canadians the opposite?
You'd have to ask him.
I will. The United States is outperforming Canada in emissions reductions without a carbon tax. If the will is there and other measures are used, is it possible for Canada to meet its emissions targets without a carbon tax?
So there are a range of measures available to reduce emissions, ranging from carbon levy to regulation to subsidies and so on. The mix that's chosen by any country to reach a target is a policy decision for that government to make. If the carbon levy were to be removed, it would need to be replaced by something equally effective, plus something additional to bridge that 4% gap that we just spoke about.
But it is possible for Canada to meet its emissions targets without a carbon tax.
It is theoretically possible, but there's not much time left between now and 2030, so changing tracks has its disadvantages, but it is theoretically possible.
Well, nothing's worked now, so I mean, like... Commissioner, we just learned that Canada now ranks 62nd out of 67 countries on the Climate Change Performance Index under this government. That's unchanged from last year despite a carbon tax increase. Is this a success?
Is what a success?
This performance?
Well, I haven't looked at that particular measure, but we have in Exhibit 7.2 a smaller sample size of the G7 countries, but we have indicated this year and last year that Canada is performing the worst amongst the G7 countries against both the 1990 baseline used in the Climate Change Convention and the 2005 baseline used in Canada's domestic target.
So, so they're the worst out of the G7?
Canada is performing the worst in terms of percentage reductions in emissions since 1990 and 2005. Indeed, since 1990, there haven't been any reductions. There's been an increase in emissions since 1990.
Wow. Oh, wow. Okay. I guess you revealed in your audit, and I quote, "The recent decreases to the projected 2030 emissions were not due to climate actions taken by governments," end quote. Does this mean the recent drop in projected emissions the government is trying to take credit for were not actually a result of policies?
So this is about projections rather than historical emissions. So you're referring to paragraph 7.24. So I mentioned 36%, which is their calculation of what their measures add up to. Previously, there was a number that was used that was 34%, I believe. And what we're saying in that paragraph is the change from 34% to 36% was not due to climate actions, but because of revisions to the data and the methods used in the modeling. So that's what we're talking about in paragraph 24.
So what was the total amount of emission reductions from the revisions in the data and modeling?
It was the difference between 34 and change and 36, so 1 point something percent.
You can table that, I guess.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Did the government conduct a value for money assessment on their oil and gas emissions cap? Yes or no?
I believe Ms. Leach has that table with her today, so let her speak to that.
So during our audit, thank you for the question. During our audit, the oil and gas emissions cap was not in place, so we didn't assess that during our audit. But it was too early to assess it, and at the time they had not completed.
So the government doesn't know how effective this policy is going to be?
We didn't look at that at the value for money assessment during our audit period, but they've since tabled draft regulation.
So how could the government know? I guess they would not know how effective this is for the value of money. Putting an emissions cap on oil and gas, they have no idea. The government has no idea what it's going to do.
We couldn't look at it during our audit because it wasn't in place yet.
Okay. Is the government using reliable emissions reduction estimates?
We have concerns about the estimates, which has been a theme in our appearances here over the last few years, regarding overly optimistic assumptions and the potential for double counting, and also the slow deployment of measures. So all of those give us pause in, for example, having confidence in the 36% that I just mentioned. That's Environment and Climate Change Canada's number. I'm not convinced that the measures that are in place now would quite reach 36% because of those concerns.
Okay, we have to stop there and go to.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome to the House of Commons. Thank you for being here. I see there are many officials from the department. Welcome, and thank you for what you do and what you provide as a service to Canadians. And I'm delighted to see you, Mr. DeMarco. It's also wonderful to hear you speak such clear and a nice French. Climate change is real, that we have to adapt to the impact of climate change, and we have to continue to reduce emissions and pollution. And we all agree on that, but some have some approaches, some have other approaches, and that's why we live in a democracy. I have some questions, and please do provide short answers. Is the government on track to meet its 2030 goals? With their current plans, it's not enough to meet their 2030 aims. Is the department aware of the fact that in line with your assessments, they will not reach their aims? Yes, this year and last year, yes. So how is it then that on several occasions the government, including the Minister of Environment in the House, just a few weeks ago was saying that for the first time in the history of Canada, we are on track to meet our 2030 goals? Why is the minister saying one thing and you're saying quite another? Well, I can only assess the measures that they have and the forecast for emissions based on their calculation of 36 points. It's not 40 to 45%. If there another opinion to be found, it's that it's according to other things that might take place between now and 2030, but keeping in light of the current measures, they will not meet their aims. This is your reading of the situation in Canada, but this morning at 1:30 a.m. Ottawa time at the COP29, I was following it virtually, zero emissions, zero budget. I was following their work. There was an annual report on the Climate Change Performance Index, and what we've learned is that 9 years under this government, Canadian government ranks 67th of 67, 62nd of 67 governments. Why is this the case? And you also mentioned the G7 countries in your report. Could you say a few words about this? Yes. As I was saying a few minutes ago, in Exhibit 2, we compare, Exhibit 7.2, we compare Canada's performance to G7 countries when it comes to reducing greenhouse gas emissions in percentage terms since 1990, and also since 2005. On both baselines, Canada is ranked 7 of the G7 countries. I haven't looked at the other report that you've just mentioned, but it's very much in line with what I just said. I'd love to give you a copy. I tried to table it at the House, but unfortunately the department representative The minister refused. So with respect to G7 countries, Canada ranks last in the G7, and yet there are governments which are much more powerful. That's when it comes to emissions. For example, the United States, our neighbor. We know that the United States have a large oil and gas industry, and we also have an oil and gas industry in Canada. The difference in Canada is that we have a carbon tax, and there isn't one in the United States. And yet the United States is doing better than Canada. How can it be? There are many more measures to keep in mind when you're assessing a country's performance. Even though Canada is doing worse than the United States has not lowered their greenhouse gas emissions significantly. I don't mean to say that if we do what the United States does, that would be enough. It would not be enough. Yes, we are ranked last, but I don't want to be ranked number 6 either. Commissioner, you're quite right. What I said initially is that we are all aware of the need to reduce pollution, but our biggest neighbor, it's the only neighbor we have, is a neighbor who also happens to be very powerful, that also has a big oil and gas industry, whereas we have a carbon tax. And even with this carbon tax, we're doing worse than the United States. So how effective is the carbon tax? Our report today looks at 20 measures, and the carbon levy is not one of these 20 because we did carry out a special audit on the carbon levy 2 years ago. We have no new observations to make on that specific subject. But we looked at the recommendation and we've seen some progress, but there's much to be done. Unfortunately, your time is up.
Mr. Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank all the witnesses for being here this afternoon and for all of your thorough and diligent work in the most recent round of audits. Commissioner DeMarco, I'd like to start with you. In Report 7, you've made a number of alarming statements about the government's emission reduction goals. You've said that their plan remains insufficient to meet Canada's target, that Canada was the worst performer amongst the G7 countries, that their measures were often overly optimistic, had missing and inconsistent information, and so forth. So in light of your findings in Report 7, I would like to read to you a series of statements, and I was wondering if you could share with the committee if those statements are accurate or inaccurate. So on May 8th in the House of Commons, Minister Guilbeault stated, quote, "For the first time in the history of Canada, we are on track to meet our 2026 and 2030 emissions targets." Commissioner, would you say that statement is accurate or inaccurate?
So we haven't done an analysis of their projections for 2026, the interim objective that we just talked about. They have told us that they believe they're on track, so that's all I have to say about that. For 2030, I do not agree that Canada's existing measures put them on track for meeting 2030. There is a gap that needs to be filled for the measures to add up to 40 to 45%.
Okay. On October 8th of this year, Minister Guilbeault said in a CBC interview, he said, quote, "What is very clear is that our plan is working." Commissioner, would you agree that the government's plan is working to achieve our 2030 targets?
The plan, as I just said, doesn't add up to the 40 to 45% target, and that's Exhibit 7.1 shows how steep the graph would have to be to reach that target. But I want to caution that it's still only 2024. It's not time to give up. So it is possible to bridge that gap over the next 6 years. And, we do owe it to Canadians, present and future, to make that effort to bridge the gap. Simply because I'm saying they're not on track now doesn't mean that it's an impossible target to meet. There is still time to meet it, but it will require more measures than are in the plan right now.
Okay, fair enough. On January 29th, in the House of Commons, Parliamentary Secretary Van Couverton stated, quote, we are ahead of our initial 2030 targets and firmly on track to meet the targets set out in our 2030 emissions plan. Commissioner, would you say that statement is accurate or inaccurate?
Well, they've never published a pathway between 2005 to 2030 in terms of annual targets, as we were just talking about. So I don't know what what shape of graph they were hoping for. So I can't really say one way or the other whether they're following the shape of graph that they intended. In terms of what you would require, just in terms of doing the math between now and 2030, we can't have any more years where it's just, 0.5% reduction or 1% reduction. We're going to need substantial reductions every year now between now and 2030 to reach the target.
Okay, let me put it this way then. If you look at report 7 and you go to page 2 and you look at the graph on page 2, would it be accurate to say based on that graph that we are ahead of our 2030 target?
Well, the only way to be ahead of the target at the current time would be to have already met it, which some of our G7 colleagues have already reached the reductions that we're hoping for in 2030 already today. So that would be ahead of it. But as I said, I don't know what pathway he is thinking they're following. But if you just draw a line on Exhibit 7.1 in terms of extrapolating the data, no, we aren't on target. But that doesn't mean, the future isn't determined entirely by the past. We have the ability to bend that curve downwards, and that requires additional measures to do so.
Okay, and my last quote, Commissioner. In December of last year on Twitter, now known as X, Minister Guilbeault stated, quote, "Our climate plan is working. We are on track to meet our goals and achieve a strong, sustainable, and secure future." Minister, would you agree that the government is on track now to meet these goals?
With the measures they have, I think we've said this a few times today, but with the measures they have that are bankable and that can be modeled right now, they even recognize themselves, and it's actually stated in the progress report that was the first one that Environment Canada put out under the Act, that they don't have bankable measures yet to meet 40 to 45%.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Leslie?
Sorry, how long, Mr. Chair? 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll start with Commissioner, thank you for being here. And I'm going to have a couple of questions for ECCC officials. So if they want to join at the table, I'm not sure they are up here just yet. And my colleague, Mr. Cram, I think did a very good job of outlining some of the more troubling statements made within your audits regarding the outcome and the track that we are on right now. And so to put simply, to reiterate for those officials that are joining here, because I'm going to ask them some questions about this, are we or are we not on target as claimed by the current Liberal government to meet our 2030 objectives? Targets, I will even say it.
So is this for the department now, or
for you first?
Oh, I think I've answered that one a few times already, haven't I? So we're just for the record, the bankable measures that are in the current 2030 emissions reduction plan, which was issued in 2022, are not sufficient to reach the target of 40 to 45% by 2030. Additional measures would be needed to bridge the gap.
The ECCC officials, now that you've heard the minister or the commissioner's recent remarks on that, in light of previous conversations where it was explained that we are actually only looking at 36% below our target levels, not 40 to 45, despite claims from the minister, parliament secretary, and many Liberal MPs. Does ECCC accept the Environment Commissioner's findings that this Liberal government is not on track to meet its 2030 objectives?
Thank you for the question, Chair. First of all, pursuant to the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, the Government of Canada must table a progress report in year 2023 to outline progress that Canada has made towards the 2030 target. In the report that was tabled in Parliament in December 2023, it was very clear that Canada actually has met its interim objective scheduled for 2026 by the degree of 22%,
Oh,
as
sorry,
well as
I need to interrupt here.
36% by 2030.
Sorry,
Additional measures need to be adopted as identified in the progress report that we will bring us to 40%.
Okay,
And in fact, in the public
thank you.
domain-
I'd like to bring this back to normal person talk. Do you agree with the commissioner of his statement that you're not on track? Yes or no?
The report clearly says that Canada is reaching 36% by 2030. With additional measures being adopted, we're able to be on track to reach 40%. And that is clearly outlined in the report table in Parliament.
So could you explain to me why you would be advising parliamentarians to say things that are well above and beyond that in the House of Commons and publicly?
So in the report table in Parliament, we clearly said that Canada is on track to 36%, and with additional measures adopted, we're able to reach 40%.
I know what it says, but here's what Canadians are asking. The commissioner under the Auditor General says one thing, and the partisan politicians that are claiming something say another thing. The question that people ask me is, well, who would I believe? To me, it's a pretty simple answer. So who should we believe?
So again, the report was tabled in Parliament subject to international domestic stakeholders review. And therefore also in September, the Government of Canada also has asked the Net Zero Advisory Body, which released a report in September recommending to government additional measures that can help the government to reach the 40 to 45% by 2030. All of this
Okay, I
is
appreciate you bringing it
domain.
back to bureaucratic speak.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
let's be respectful.
Yeah, I think it's really unnecessary to talk down
I speak
and
frankly.
condescend
I'm okay with it.
to
Okay, I
our
speak like a normal
witnesses.
person. Are there performance bonuses within ECCC and whether or not they succeed at these targets? And has one ever been awarded based on that report that was tabled previously that you talked about?
I'm not able to really answer that question on behalf of the entire department.
Well,
That being said-
however you want to. Has there been any?
He'll answer the question. Yes, continue, please. Not able to answer on behalf of the entire department.
Not able to to answer on behalf of the department. That being said, different objectives and deliverables are set, in a particular year. I do not believe that any particular official be asked to be accountable for an objective that is a shared jurisdictions between federal government, provinces, and territories.
Okay, so is there a chance they can get a bonus? Because it seems clear that those at the political level are not held accountable for when the failures exist. Are there performance bonuses if targets are met or if they're not?
I don't think the Department of Environment is Exxon. I don't think it's a business. I don't think you get bonuses if you meet a certain
I mean,
sales
the CBC
target.
does.
That's my understanding, but what do I know? Anyway, time's up. To Mr. Leslie. No, is it Mr. Leslie? I have Mr. Leslie twice. Is it? Yeah?
It's up and down. How long?
5.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner, through your audit, you discovered that the Liberals had not conducted value for money assessments on 5 of their measures. What does that mean, and why would you think that they should be?
So value for money is very important because several of these measures have substantial price tags associated with them in terms of Canadian taxpayers or the private sector or the government itself in the case of subsidies and so on. So value for money is important because it gives Canadians a sense, if you do a proper value for money assessment, it gives Canadians the sense that they're getting good bang for the buck, using a more colloquial term for the use of taxpayer money. So essentially, you're showing your calculation to the Canadians that we're spending this billions of dollars and we're expecting X value, and you quantify that. We've talked about that here, and we talked about that in the Net Zero Accelerator report from earlier this year. It's an important accountability measure in a nutshell.
I agree. And through your audit, did the department explain why they wouldn't do that?
So Ms. Leach can address that.
Yes, thank you. There's a good explanation for that. We had made a recommendation, so recommendation 7.34, that the government establish a government-wide approach and guidance for value for money assessments. And the Department, Environment Climate Change Canada, had only partially agreed with that. And the reason that they stated that, you know, the value in federal decision-making is very multifaceted. It includes things like society, culture, health, Indigenous, territorial relations that are outside the remit of ECC. So there are many things that are important besides money.
Sure. Thank you. You mentioned the whole of government approach, which is something that gets thrown around a lot, but you also alluded to some of the silos that certainly still exist across departments when we have as many measures, although maybe not successful measures, but measures nonetheless that the government has attempted to undertake here. And the claim of a whole of government approach, how do you explain the silos that still continue to exist that lead to things like double counting of emissions, a lack of credibility of the modeling, and going back to the previous audit on the 2 billion tree program? How does this happen so frequently under this government?
Yeah, so that's one of the conclusions from our first report under this act from last year, from last fall, is that the system that Canada uses, and I'm just talking about the federal government, we're ignoring the other jurisdictions for now, but in terms of coordinating the efforts in a horizontal way, which is the term that's used by the federal government in Canada, they have not nailed that yet. Essentially, there are problems in terms of coordinating amongst Environment and Climate Change Canada, NRCan, ISET, and so on. And without there being a central agency or a central approach to this, you have the potential for, and in actual fact, double counting and even sometimes cases of working at cross purposes. So our recommendations from our first report last fall, if implemented, could help address that very important problem in terms of siloed approaches at the federal government level.
Thank you. Now, you mentioned in the audit that the recent decreases or getting closer to the gap of the 2030 targets were attributable due to revisions in data and modeling methodologies. Could you explain a little bit of what those changes were? And in your experience, have you ever seen a government make changes to their data modeling that made it further away from the target they're trying to reach, or only closer?
So these updates to the modeling are done to make the projections more accurate. And it's not just Canada doing them. Some of them come from calculations about the warming potential of various different greenhouse gases, not just CO2, but the other ones as well. So Ms. Leach can explain that in greater detail. But to answer your last question there, I don't know each time that they've modeled it, whether it's brought them closer or further. The point isn't to remodel to make it further or closer, it's to make it more accurate.
Yeah, and we also have the department here who can tell you more about exactly the differences in the modeling. But yeah, we have pointed out in one of our paragraphs, which is 7.26, that some of the measures, that the initial estimates of emission reductions were high in the beginning, and they were different. So the revised estimates were lower than originally anticipated in 6 of the 12 funding measures that we looked at, which means that the modeling was not as accurate in the beginning as it.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you again to the witnesses. Commissioner, I'll have one final question on Report 7. On page 7, you identified the Small Modular Reactor Action Plan as facing implementation challenges. Could you elaborate on what implementation challenges the Small Modular Reactor Action Plan is facing and what seems to be the holdup?
Okay, so the details on that are provided in Appendix B. So the Small Modular Reactor Action Plan implementation facing challenges are in 3 categories. Timeliness, so the measure was delayed. expected emissions avoided. There had been no assessment of the expected emissions avoided for this measure, as we've heard earlier, and there had not been an assessment of value for money. So it faced all three of those types of challenges in our detailed analysis, which is found in Appendix B.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner. Let's shift gears now to Report 6, the critical minerals strategy. How many critical minerals mining permits have been issued since the launch of the critical minerals strategy?
I certainly don't know that answer. The answer to that, I'm not sure if you would know.
No, probably
No.
the department likely be the best.
I would say NRCan would be the best source of information on that. But of course, permits are mostly provincial or territorial, not federal. So keep that in mind as well.
Okay. And to the best of, I'm sorry, do any of the department officials want to take that?
That is actually correct. It's mainly on the provincial level that the permits would be issued. We have, for example, fisheries permit that could be issued. We have explosive permits that could be issued. So for those, absolutely, we could provide you with those. But provinces have the main, territories have main responsibilities when it comes to mining.
Okay, but does that include uranium mining? I believe uranium mining is federally permitted, is it not?
Uranium is on the list of critical minerals.
Okay.
So we'd have to go back and verify that in terms of permitting.
Okay, if you could provide that answer in writing, I would appreciate it. Let's see. In your assessment of the critical mineral strategy, did you review how Canada's regulatory approval timelines compare to our international competitors?
I don't believe we did a comparison in terms of the timelines for approval. And of course, that would even change by province and territory because there is no one timeline for approving a mine in Canada. It's the main, as we just heard, the main permitting authorities are provinces and territories. So there would be many different timelines depending on the jurisdiction.
And Mr. Chair, how am I doing for time? Pretty much up. Okay. Okay.